Hey, it is a deal.
Take it, why don't you lick it? Take, why don't you take? Give, why don't you give it? Stop, don't make me stop, 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 stop,
Why don't you feel rocket? Feel, touch, hey. Feel rocket. Feel, touch, hey. It is a deal. Rocket, rocket. Why don't you rock and feel? Why don't you feel? Touch. Why don't you touch it? Hey. It is a deal.
take it, why don't you lick it? Take, why don't you take? Give, why don't you give it? Stop, don't make me take it, why don't you lick it? Take, why don't you take? Take, give, why don't you give it? Stop, don't make me take.
Rocket, why don't you rock and feel? Why don't you feel? Touch, why don't you touch it? Hey, it is a
Take it, why don't you lick it? Take, why don't you take? Give, why don't you give it? Stop, don't make me stay.